That was the moment I decided that if I couldn't save those young women, at least I could document what was happening to them. It would be my act of resistance, a way to make sure they wouldn't be completely forgotten. My parents came a few times at first, but Augusto always found ways to make those visits uncomfortable. Caustic comments, insinuations about their simplicity, complaints about the disruption they caused in the house. Over time, the visits dwindled to almost nothing. My friends from Pelotas were no longer part of my life. In the meantime, my own prison became increasingly suffocating. Augusto controlled every aspect of my life with chilling precision. My schedule, my clothes, even the food I ate. Everything was scrutinized by him. The house staff were instructed to watch me closely and report any inappropriate behavior. Some returned changed, silent, frightened, with vacant stares. Others simply vanished. They ran away, Augusto would say, ungrateful. He always added that with an icy smile that made me uneasy, and the cycle would begin again with new young women and fresh dreams ready to be shattered. I kept track. I confronted Augusto as soon as he got home that afternoon. It was one of the few times I found the courage to challenge him directly. "Where is Linda?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear that gripped me inside. "Mendez's country house," another brother from the store, and on it went, page after page of unfinished stories. Sometimes I overheard bits of conversations between Augusto and the other men. They talked about orders from the north, high-value goods for export. It took me a long time to realize they weren't talking about fabrics. They're given opportunities, housing, food, and as soon as they save a little money, they vanish without explanation. It happens all the time. And those conversations you say you hear? Augusto is a businessman. Of course he talks about merchandise prices and exports. That's his job. But it was the only thing I could do at that moment. Document, record, and make sure that someday someone would know the truth. That those girls wouldn't just become numbers, statistics in a missing persons file, but would be remembered as human beings with dreams, hopes, and families. Like Linda, who wanted to be a teacher, just like all the others who came after her. I tried to encourage her to share more, to give details, but she recoiled into a terrifying silence. I promised that I would protect her, that I wouldn't let them take her to another meeting, that we would find a way to get her back home, to her family. Empty words, I knew that, but what else could I say? And Augusto, oh, he had a special talent for making choices. He concealed his knack for spotting the most vulnerable among them, those who had nothing to lose and carried the weight of their entire families on their shoulders. They arrived full of hope and grateful for the opportunity they were given. 2 weeks after that lunch, I managed to get a moment alone with Antonio. Augusto had gone to handle business at the main store, and the staff were busy in the back. It was my chance, maybe my only one. My heart racing, I shared my suspicions about the girls who were disappearing, about the strange conversations I'd overheard, about the constant fear haunting me. I spilled everything at once, my words tumbling out in confusion as tears streamed uncontrollably down my face. The isolation was so complete that when my younger brother Antonio moved to Porto Alegre in 1959, it felt like a part of the sky had opened. Antonio was 21, freshly graduated in accounting, and had landed a job at a prestigious bank in the capital. She disappeared in June, leaving behind a letter from her sick mother. Antonia Rivers, 16, from Novo Hamburgo, arrived in April, was taken to the special meeting in July, but ran away that very night. Juras Oliveira, 15, from Caxias, worked for 3 months and vanished after attending a party at Dr. Little did I know that small bubble of comfort would soon be swallowed up by the sea of horrors dominating my life. On a Sunday afternoon, during one of those family lunches, I noticed something was different about Antonio. He seemed more serious, more formal. "Mind your own business," he said with a chilling calmness. "I know exactly what I'm doing." On the night of the meeting, I saw Linda being led away with 2 other girls. She wore an outfit I had never seen before, a tight, low-cut black dress, completely inappropriate for someone her age. She looked uncomfortable and scared. In the first few months, he visited me whenever he could, bringing news from the family, stories from the city, and a glimpse of the outside world I longed for. Augusto wasn't thrilled, of course, but he tolerated it. After all, he was my brother, my own blood. I spent the rest of the day restless, thinking about how I could help her. Maybe I could come up with the money for her ticket, or perhaps hide her somewhere safe. However, every plan ran into the same difficult barrier: Augusto, his authority, his influence, and his brothers in key positions around the city. Still, I had to try. I got a simple little notebook, one of those school notebooks, and hid it inside the lining of my sewing chair, the only place in the house Augusto didn't search, assuming it was women's stuff. They all ended up running away, always taking something precious, always at night, never saying goodbye, leaving behind important belongings, letters from family, small keepsakes, sometimes even documents. With each disappearance, Augusto told the same story with slight variations: ungratefulness, theft, a secret escape. Ever closed your eyes to something you knew deep down was wrong? Be honest in the comments, because that's exactly what I did that day. I ignored the truth because I was terrified of what it meant. If I admitted to myself what really happened to Linda, I would have to confront the monstrosity of the man I was married to. The bed was made, the small wardrobe bare, and the bedside table empty. Even the photo of her mother she always kept near the bed was gone. I asked the other girls, who were just as puzzled as I was. No one had seen Linda since the night before. No one knew where she'd gone. It was as if Linda had vanished into thin air. They came from small towns in the countryside of Rio Grande do Sul, from Santa Catarina, and some even from Paraná, daughters of farmers, laborers, and domestic workers, girls who had never left their hometowns before, looking at Porto Alegre as if it were a promised land. The months after Linda's disappearance felt like living in a nightmare in slow motion, a horror unfolding day by day, and I couldn't stop it. Augusto's sponsorship program had become a well-oiled machine. Every 2 or 3 months, new young women would arrive, always beautiful, always eager for a chance to change their lives. I couldn't abandon her. The next morning, I woke up determined to act. I would go to the shelter, talk to Linda, and together we'd come up with a plan. But when I arrived, I found her room empty. Our eyes met briefly as she got into the car that would take them to the meeting. There was something in her gaze, maybe a silent cry for help, that haunted me all night. I couldn't sleep. I paced through the empty house, imagining what might be happening at that meeting, fearing the worst. But what could I do? Accuse Augusto directly? Go to the police? That was being handled by another brother who ran the store, searching for her family in Caxias, who had probably already been officially notified of her disappearance. I stayed silent, holding back tears, fury, and despair. I'm overseeing your initiation. I looked at Antonio, silently hoping it was just a joke, a misunderstanding. He simply averted his gaze, embarrassed but undeniably proud. At that moment, I lost my last connection to the outside world, my final hope for rescue. They worked hard in the stores, studied at night, sending most of their meager wages back home. They dreamed of the future, becoming teachers, nurses, or even starting their own businesses someday. After a few months, an invitation would come to attend one of the special meetings at the store. I had no answers, only fear, guilt, and that secret diary, which, if discovered, would surely cost me my life. I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into a vast emptiness. As I approached, I noticed bruises on her neck, partially hidden by a scarf. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. There were scratches on her arms, and a bruise was just beginning to form on her temple. When Augusto returned, it was almost morning. He was drunk, with lipstick stains on his shirt that he didn't even try to hide. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep instantly. I stayed awake, waiting. At dawn, I hurried to the accommodations. I needed to see Linda, to know if she was all right. I also jotted down bits of conversations I overheard between Augusto and his brothers, random phrases about orders, merchandise, and profits to be shared. With every page filled, a horrifying pattern began to emerge, a truth so terrifying I could barely face it. We offer them opportunities, shelter, and food, and in return they just vanish like thieves in the dead of night. He claimed that she had stolen jewelry from the store and cash from the register, saying he'd already told the police, but she was probably long gone, maybe even in another state by now. I knew that was a lie, each with her own story of struggle and despair. And suddenly, I spotted the brooch, small and discreet, but unmistakably the golden square and compass on the lapel of his new blazer. My blood ran cold. Augusto, noticing my reaction, smiled in a way that made me feel sick. "Your brother is one of us now," he declared with a tone of superiority. Between 1958 and 1960, at least 17 young women escaped this way. 17 lives that crossed our path and disappeared like smoke. My secret notebook began to fill with names, dates, and details. In it, I recorded everything I could find out. Mary Celeste Santos, 17 years old, from Canoas, arrived in March 1958. His hand was firm on my arm, fingers closing like claws whenever I crossed a line. If I talked too much, laughed too loudly, or drew attention in a way that displeased him, my family hardly visited anymore. At night, locked in the bathroom with the shower running to mask any sounds, I would reread those notes and wonder what was really happening to these young women, where they were taken, if they were still alive, and most importantly, what could I do to stop more from disappearing? "What happened?" I asked, sitting beside her and holding her cold hands in mine. She didn't answer right away, just let the tears fall silently. After what felt like an eternity, she finally murmured, almost in a whisper, "The boss and his friends aren't what they seem." I pretended to agree, lowered my head, and kept playing the role of the perfect wife. But inside, something was shifting. Fear gradually gave way to another emotion, a silent, deep anger that grew with each passing day, with every girl who vanished, with each lie I was forced to swallow. I couldn't go out alone, receive visitors without his prior approval, or answer the phone without his permission. The only outings allowed were social events, parties, dinners, and openings, where he paraded me like a trophy, always keeping me by his side. And even worse, I'd have to face my own cowardice, my silent complicity. Linda's disappearance was only the beginning. The next week, 3 new girls arrived to take her place, younger, more desperate, with even sadder stories. And so the cycle started again. Some stayed for months, others just weeks. I was absolutely sure Linda would never steal. She would never give up on her dream of helping her sick mother, of becoming a teacher, and above all, she would never leave behind that photo, the only memento she had of her family. Something terrible must have happened to her. I felt it deep in every fiber of my being. When I finished, breathless and searching for some sign of empathy or help, his reaction hit me like a blow. "You've always had a vivid imagination, Teresina, even as a child inventing stories," he said. "Augusto warned me that you've been unstable, that some days you make things up in your head." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own brother, who grew up by my side and knew me better than anyone, was calling me a liar, calling me crazy. "The girls leave out of ingratitude," he repeated Augusto's exact words. I started writing down everything in it. Full names of the girls, their ages, backgrounds, physical descriptions when they arrived, when they were taken to special meetings, and when they disappeared. He looked at me with that cold contempt he always showed, as if I were an irritating child asking uncomfortable questions. "She ran away," he answered curtly, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "These girls from the countryside are all the same, ungrateful." Augusto deemed them classless, unsuitable for the wife of a man in his position. Gradually, my world shrank to those marble and mahogany walls, the fake smiles at high society events, and the constant fear that had become my only true companion. Augusto smiled, fully aware of what I was thinking, pleased by my helplessness. Can you imagine how I felt at that moment? Part of me knew the story about her running away was a lie, while another part was too afraid to face the truth. Have you ever ignored something horrible because you were scared of the consequences? When I was sure no one was watching, I reached into the lining, into my secret hiding spot. For a moment of pure panic, I thought it wouldn't be there. But then my fingers touched the little notebook. It was exactly where I had left it. She paused, glanced toward the door to make sure no one was near, and leaned in, almost whispering in my ear. I know what happens to the girls. My cousin was one of them. My heart raced. For the first time in years, someone not only believed me, but also confirmed my deepest suspicions. What happened to her? There are others, wives, sisters, even daughters. Women who see, who hear, who are tired of pretending not to notice, not to see, and not to listen. Helena stepped forward. We have a code, subtle signs, keywords, ways to communicate without them realizing. The butterfly. She touched the brooch that Carmela was wearing. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Augusto greeted me with a bouquet of roses and a diamond necklace, his usual sick ritual. He smiled as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't almost killed me just weeks before. Welcome back, dear. I hope you've learned your lesson. She said there were others like her, dozens, all brought from the South by men wearing a golden brooch, as she called it, trafficking. The word I couldn't even bring myself to say, not even in my mind, was now becoming clear and undeniable. It was at one of those parties at our home, a charity event to raise funds for an orphanage, ironically, that I noticed something that would change everything. Augusto had turned the house upside down, searching for proof of my conspiracy theories, but he hadn't found the one thing that could truly incriminate him. That little notebook was now even more valuable and dangerous. It was my only evidence, my only leverage against Augusto, but it also meant my potential death if discovered. It was a glance exchanged between two women, the wife of Dr. Mendez and the Judge Torres's wife, when Augusto mentioned the sponsorship program and how a new group of young women would be arriving the following month. A quick look, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. And then I noticed other things, like how I tried to insist, to prove I wasn't making things up, that the pattern was too obvious to be mere coincidence. With no money, no documents, Augusto kept those locked away, and no one I could trust. Even my own brother betrayed me, calling me crazy. The police were compromised by the brothers. It was in this fragile, watched state and without hope that I made a discovery that nearly made me collapse. When I entered the dressing room, I noticed several pieces of clothing were out of place. The drawers weren't fully closed and the shoe boxes were slightly misaligned. Just as we were about to continue our conversation, we heard footsteps in the hallway. June quickly slipped back into her professional role, jotting something down on her clipboard and adjusting the IV. By the time the chief doctor, another man wearing a gold lapel pin, came in for the night rounds, she was already gone. Augusto was sitting in the armchair, holding a glass of whiskey, watching. "You're going to learn to keep quiet," he said calmly, "or next time I won't stop until I make sure you never speak again." The next morning I could barely move. The pain was unbearable, and breathing was hard, broken ribs, no doubt. Carefully, so as not to make noise, I climbed onto a chair and reached for the heavy book. Using an embroidery blade, I cut several pages in half, creating a compartment. There, I hid my diary. I quickly put the Bible back, praying sincerely and desperately that this hiding place would be safer than the last. That night, when Augusto returned, Antonio had already left, but there was a different vibe in the air. His look at me, the one I knew so well and that made me shrink inside, was even colder, more threatening. "Your little brother came to see me this afternoon," he said casually as he adjusted his tie. My stomach sank. The media would never publish anything against such influential men without solid proof, which I didn't have, except for my hidden diary and stories they could easily dismiss as female hysteria. When I walked into that house, which I never managed to call home, utter despair overwhelmed me. The walls seemed to close in. Gradually, fear was giving way to a cold, calculated anger that grew with each young woman who disappeared, with every new lie I was forced to support. I kept up with my diary, now with even greater caution. Years, June replied. Decades, maybe. It's a massive, well-organized operation. There are powerful people in this game, politicians, judges, businessmen. They use Freemasonry as a front, as a safety net. The true Masons, the honest ones, have no idea what's really going on in these so-called special lodges. It seemed you had been coming up with some very creative ideas about me, about my business. He closed in slowly, like a predator stalking its prey. Do you know what happens to women who make up stories about their husbands, Teresina? I didn't answer. I could barely breathe. Pimentel, who was usually so talkative, remained completely silent throughout the conversation, nervously fiddling with an emerald brooch. Not the Masonic brooch, but one shaped like a butterfly. Then something even more unusual happened. Mrs. Pimentel approached me, apparently intending to compliment the room's decor. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. June took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. When she was just 17, my cousin started working in a fabric store, thinking it was a great chance to change her life, to leave the countryside and study in the capital. A few months later, they took her to one of those meetings. That was the last time I saw her. The official story was that she had run away and stolen merchandise, but a year later, I received a letter. June hesitated, as if fighting to say the words. She was in Mato Grosso, living in a house where men stayed. I became an even better actress, flawlessly playing the role of the submissive and grateful wife. I smiled at the right moments, said the expected words. I was the perfect hostess at the parties and dinners that Augusto often organized. Internally, though, something was shifting. But Augusto had other ideas about how my recovery would go. You fell down the stairs, he announced as two of his brothers helped lift me into the car. The employees were instructed to treat me like a disabled person, someone mentally ill who needed constant supervision. I could barely go to the bathroom without one of them nearby. My confinement, which was already suffocating, had now become a straitjacket. If something happened to me, and I was sure one day it would, at least there would be that record left behind, proof those young women had existed, that their disappearances were no coincidence, that a perverse system operated in the shadows of social respectability. I decided I needed to find a better hiding place. That very night, while everyone was asleep, I quietly went down to the library. There was an old edition of the Bible, impressive and sitting on a high shelf that was hardly ever touched. Augusto displayed it as a decoration, a sign of his fake religiosity, but he never read it. He didn't only use his hands and the belt. He brought out a heavy cast-iron fireplace poker, aiming at my ribs, legs, and arms. Never my face, never where bruises could be seen through normal clothes. At one point, I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was lying in a pool of my own blood on the cold floor of the room. I learned that years ago she had briefly worked at one of Augusto's stores, but was let go for asking too many questions. One night, while fixing my pillow, June confided in me about the girls who went missing and the secret meetings. As she remarked on the floral arrangements, her hand briefly touched mine, deliberately, not by accident, and I felt something pressed against my palm. When she pulled away, I discreetly examined what it was, a small folded piece of paper. I waited for the perfect moment when no one was watching to unfold the message. Library 23. On my 5th day there, I met June, a nurse who stood out from the rest, older, with kind eyes that genuinely saw me. She would come into the room at night when things were quieter and stayed a little longer than necessary. As she adjusted my equipment and changed my dressings, she spoke softly. It was a terrible accident. You're delirious from pain saying nonsense. That's the story we'll tell everyone at the hospital. The hospital was a private, costly, discreet clinic where another brother was the medical director. During the rare moments I managed to be alone in the library, I updated my notes, names, dates, snippets of conversations, patterns I was noticing. It was meticulous documentation, my silent form of resistance. Butterfly. Brief, mysterious, but unmistakably a call for a secret meeting. At exactly 11 p.m., my heart pounding so hard I feared someone might hear it, I entered the library. The house was still buzzing with guests, the party going strong downstairs, which ironically made this clandestine meeting easier. The months that followed were a true test of survival. Augusto watched me even more closely, always on the lookout for signs of instability, ready to punish me for any mistake. Fear was my constant companion, overshadowing even the physical pain from the beatings that continued, less frequent now, but no less brutal. I stayed there for almost 2 weeks, officially diagnosed with multiple fractures from an accidental fall. Doctors and nurses struggled to pretend they believed me, avoiding my gaze and sedating me whenever I tried to share anything that strayed from the official story. Augusto and the men at the store weren't just exploiting those girls, they were selling them and sending them to brothels in remote places where no one would look for them, where they'd become just another lost soul trapped in misery. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. On the other side of the room, grouped in small circles, were the wives, elegant, educated, and discreet women like me. I always smiled at them, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, fashion, or some of their children, but that night I didn't really see them until one detail made me look more closely. Someone had carefully gone through my things, trying not to leave obvious traces. My heart stopped when I thought about the diary. I ran to my sewing chair, trying to stay calm. I sat down, picked up the unfinished embroidery, and took a deep breath. Augusto was in the center of the room, surrounded by his brothers, all dressed formally, each wearing the golden brooch on their lapels, laughing and drinking expensive champagne while discussing their charitable works. In the nights that followed, I waited anxiously for her to return, desperate for more information, guidance on how to handle that terrifying knowledge. But June never came back. When I asked another nurse about her, all I got was a disinterested shrug. They end up in places where no one hears their screams, places they can never return from. The beating that night was different from all the others. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a message, a show of total control. No one would notice our absence amidst so many people. Mrs. Pimentel, Carmela, I learned was her first name, was already there, along with 2 others, Mrs. Mendez, Helena, and Mrs. Azevedo, Beatrice. They all looked at me with a mix of caution and hope. Carmela was the first to break the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We know you know. We saw it in your eyes, in the way you watch the young women, how you react when they disappear." I didn't answer right away. It could be a trap, a test set by Augusto to confirm his suspicions about me. Carmela seemed to sense my fear. Slowly, she unbuttoned the sleeve of her elegant dress and lifted the delicate fabric, revealing long, deep scars, clearly the result of deliberate violence. "We all carry scars," she said simply. Helena and Beatrice felt it too, sensing a silent understanding among the 4 of us. There was no need to reveal our scars to each other to know they were there, some visible, others buried much deeper. "We are not alone," continued Carmela. But he cut me off, visibly irritated. "Enough, Teresina. You're being paranoid. Augusto only wants what's best for you, for all of us. He's helping me build a future. He's opened doors I didn't even know existed. And this is how you repay me, with these crazy accusations?" By then, I was completely certain my suspicions were right. I realized I was married to a real monster who was part of a network of trafficking and exploitation, and there was nothing I could do about it. Who would believe me? A woman up against a group of powerful men. Where could I run? She was reassigned to another department, or who knows, maybe she decided to quit. Those experienced nurses were always moving in and out. I went home feeling worse than when I left for the hospital. It wasn't just the physical pain, which still burned sharply, but the overwhelming helplessness. Cardoso tightened her grip on the glass when she heard her husband joke about exports to the north, how Mrs. Azevedo took a deep breath and looked away when the subject of a house in Mato Grosso came up. How Mrs. We had no idea when or how this case would come to light. We didn't know if any of us would ever see justice served, but we persevered, united by a common goal and strengthened by the conviction that we were not alone. After that night when I realized I wasn't alone, my life took on a new purpose. The fear was still there, palpable. I'm not some movie heroine who suddenly becomes fearless, but now I carried a spark of hope to brighten the darkest nights. To keep merely existing day after day, witnessing that spectacle of terror without intervening, or to risk everything, my safety, possibly even my life, for a chance at justice. You could be our eyes and ears right at the heart of the operation. Small acts of rebellion that, when combined, became something greater, more powerful than any of us alone. The danger was constant and immense. Every movement, every word was carefully calculated. Augusto, always wary and alert, seemed to have a sixth sense for spotting potential betrayals. And it was this certainty that kept me alive, giving me the strength to endure the ongoing abuse, the veiled threats, the suffocating control. Each new dawn was a small victory. Every piece of information I managed to pass along to the network was an act of resistance. "The girls don't escape," she whispered as we pretended to admire a sapphire necklace. "They're transported in trucks, sometimes by small planes, to the north and Midwest. Mines in Rondonia, isolated farms in Mato Grosso, brothels in the border regions of Acre. Just picturing it made my stomach churn." "You're in a unique position, Teresina. You're the wife of one of the leaders. Augusto trusts his influence over you so much. He's so sure of your fear that at times he lets his guard down. Besides, you have direct access to the young girls before they're processed. You can help us identify them, document their arrivals and departures." There were women working undercover as employees in the homes of other members, and others stationed in key stores and offices, each gathering pieces of information that, when combined, revealed a terrifying and wider picture of the operation. "And what would my role be?" I asked, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "It all began nearly a decade ago," she once confided to me while we pretended to examine fabrics in a department store, one of the few places where we could talk without raising suspicion, just the three of us, wives who, each in our own way, had uncovered what our husbands really did during their secret meetings at the store. "Some try, but most don't survive long enough to tell." Those words echoed in my mind for days. I thought of Linda, with her dream of becoming a teacher, Maria Celeste, who wanted to be a nurse, and Jurachi, who was still practically a child. Because understand this, what I'm telling you doesn't just concern me, but is also the experience of hundreds, maybe thousands of women trapped in marriages that feel like prisons, with men who act as their jailers. Women whose voices have been silenced, whose lives have been controlled, whose bodies bear the marks of brutality. Quickly, Carmela grabbed a book from the shelf and opened it to a random page. The others gathered around, as if they were simply admiring an illustration. When the door opened, one of the guests, too drunk to notice anything unusual, apologized for the interruption and left. "We are just women against powerful, connected men who control everything: the police, the justice system, the press." Helena smiled, not a smile of joy, but one of determination. A handkerchief folded a certain way meant a conversation was needed. A butterfly brooch worn on the left lapel signaled, "I have news." A specific flower in the main arrangement during a dinner served as a warning. "Be cautious. Someone is uncertain." Over time, we refined this code, making it more sophisticated and secure. Some, like Helena, whose husband was a doctor, had access to information about the underground clinics where certain young women were taken before being transported. Others, like Beatrice, the wife of a customs agent, gathered information about routes, shipping dates, and destinations. It was a risky role, perhaps the most dangerous of all, but it also gave me a chance to turn my suffering into something meaningful, to use my victimhood as a weapon against the very system oppressing me. I accepted, of course. What choice did I have? The decision turned out to be simpler than I expected. Maybe because deep down I already sensed my fate was sealed. Augusto would never allow me to escape. He would never set me free. But something fundamental had changed. The feeling of total isolation, of absolute helplessness, had been broken. There were others, there was a plan, there was hope. I bet you don't have the courage to give this video a thumbs up. Society prefers to ignore these stories, treating them as things of the past. However, before we returned to the hall, Carmela squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Teresina. Remember that in tough times." I went back to the party with a heart lighter than it had been in years. I served drinks, smiled at the guests, played my role as hostess perfectly. After so long feeling alone, isolated, powerless, discovering that there were others like me, watching, resisting, seeking a way to face that horror, felt like finding water in the desert. Do you know what happens to the young ones? I finally found my voice and asked. The three exchanged heavy looks, full of terrible knowledge. It was a secret language, a code created over the years by women who, like me, lived under the shadow of monsters disguised as respectable men. Carmela explained more about this in our brief meetings, always disguised as simple coincidences, always protected by carefully crafted alibis. Each woman whose name and story I documented was a silent promise. You will not be forgotten. You will not vanish without a trace. Your life matters. It was little, so little in the face of such overwhelming horror, but it was all we could do at the time. And on some of the darkest nights, that was enough to keep me going. We know, Carmela confirmed. Some are sold to brothels in the North and Midwest. Others are the problematic ones, the ones who resist too much. These face an even worse fate. She didn't need to say more. The silence that followed spoke volumes. What can we do? I asked, despair threatening to overwhelm me again. It was this way, patiently and step by step, that we began building a case against them, against the trafficking network hiding behind the respectable facade of masonry, against powerful men who treated human lives like commodities, against a system that allowed all of this to happen in broad daylight, sustained by silence, fear, and complicity. There were moments when I feared I had been discovered. A lingering look, a seemingly innocent question about my new interests. In those moments, the fear was so intense I could barely breathe, yet somehow I managed to keep my composure. Years of forced pretense now served a purpose far beyond mere survival. All of them were now lost in a distant place, treated like property, their dreams shattered and their lives stolen. Anger began to overshadow fear. A cold and calculated rage brought a clarity I had never experienced before. It was no longer enough to document and observe. I needed to take action, to find concrete evidence that even the brothers, with all their power, could not suppress. A few weeks later, the opportunity arose. Augusto took a trip to the countryside, a 2-day journey to visit a new property he had bought in Novo Hamburgo. The men in those places, miners, ranch hands, lumberjacks, pay well for young wives from the South, especially those with fair skin. A wave of nausea hit me. I had to steady myself against the counter to keep from fainting, and they never, ever managed to escape or send word. Carmela shook her head. "Darling Carmela, I love this fabric," I would say, brushing my dress. And in the handshake that followed, a small piece of paper exchanged hands, unseen by those watching us. It was during one of those meetings at the launch of a jewelry collection that Carmela confirmed my worst fears. But I also began sharing information with the network, always with the utmost caution, using codes and established channels. A note hidden inside a particular book at the public library, an apparently casual phrase dropped during a charity tea, an embroidery pattern that to trained eyes carried a secret message. Camilla Pepper became my most important connection. The wife of one of the most prominent Masons, she had access to information no one else did. We met in unexpected places, charity teas, store openings, art exhibitions, always surrounded by others, always pretending casual interest in trivial matters. We began to document names, dates, locations, snippets of conversations overheard behind closed doors, documents found in unlocked drawers. Gradually, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. I discovered that each of us had a specific role within the network. In the months that followed, I learned a secret language that existed right under the noses of those arrogant men. It was incredible how they never noticed, so used to viewing us as mere ornaments, as beings without will, that they never imagined we might be plotting against them. It all started with small details. In the days that followed, I began to notice signs that had previously gone unnoticed. The butterfly brooch some women subtly wore at social events, the emphasis on certain words during ordinary conversations, the quick but meaningful glances exchanged whenever specific topics came up. Even more heartbreaking are the stories of those young girls who disappeared without a trace, who were treated as commodities, whose dreams were shattered by men hiding behind respectable appearances. Sooner or later, I would become too much of a burden, too dangerous, and I would meet the same fate as so many of the girls. If I was going to die anyway, I might as well die fighting. So I embraced that silent resistance. I kept writing my diary, now with even more detail and precision. I realized how those women had become experts in disguise, how they had mastered the art of going unnoticed, of existing in the shadows, turning their invisibility into a weapon. We couldn't continue our conversation that night. It was too risky to stay away from the party for too long. We are already 17, spread across different circles, in various positions, gathering information, documenting, building a case that even they, with all their power, won't be able to silence when it comes to light. Before they could say more, we heard footsteps in the hallway. There was a network of quiet yet observant women, gathering evidence, documenting crimes, ready for a moment of justice that felt so distant it was almost intangible, yet close enough to keep hope alive. I was not alone in my pain, my fear, my anger, and perhaps, just maybe, I was not alone in my struggle. Being underestimated is actually our greatest advantage. They see us as mere ornaments, as possessions, as silent figures. Don't they realize we hear everything, see everything, know everything? And most importantly, they can't imagine that we could unite. Beatrice agreed. That night, after all the guests had left, and with Augusto finally asleep, too drunk to notice any change in my behavior, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on what I had discovered. It's one of those signals. It shows that we are trustworthy. Beatrice, who had been silent until that moment, added, "We have been watching you for years, Teresina. We have seen your suffering, your silent struggle, and we decided it was time to bring you into our circle." I couldn't hold back my tears. Carmela gave a subtle smile. "Legitimate business," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He left strict instructions. "You must not leave the house. I can't have visitors. Everything needs to be in perfect order for your return." The maids were, as always, assigned to keep an eye on me. But a gap appeared. Donna June, the housekeeper, had a sick sister and asked for permission to visit her that afternoon. Augusto, always eager to seem generous, agreed. She would be gone for a few hours, and the young maid was easily distracted. As soon as Donna June left, I put my plan into motion. I asked the younger maid to go to the pharmacy to buy medicine for a headache, a simple and believable excuse. "Take as long as you need," I said, pretending to be generous. At first, it was just a support group, a place for us to cry together, sharing the heavy burden of that knowledge. But soon we realized we were capable of more, that we had a duty to do more. She hesitated, seeming to consider a silk cut. Even our embroidery conveyed messages, patterns that to the untrained eye looked like mere floral designs, but for us they were maps, dates, names. I learned to recognize other allies at social events, women who, like me, led double lives, outwardly submissive ornamental wives, inwardly warriors in a silent battle. Prove you're different, that you have the courage to face reality. Every thumbs up is a slap in the face to those who seek to silence women like me. On one side was the legitimate group, led by people like him, who adhered to the traditional principles of the Brotherhood. On the other side, a dissident faction had infiltrated the formal structures and was exploiting the prestige and Masonic network for their own sinister purposes. It wasn't long before the door opened quietly. Theodore entered, quickly checking to make sure we were alone, then settled into a nearby armchair. "Mrs. Bastos, or may I call you Teresina? Your father spoke very highly of you." The mention of my father caught me off guard. Did he know him well? He smiled with genuine warmth. "Darling, what a lovely surprise. I thought you wouldn't be back until tomorrow." His gaze studied me like a scientist examining a rare specimen. There was a complication. The matter would need further evaluation before anything could be finalized. He sniffed the air like a predator. "Where are the servants?" I explained about Mrs. I would become an internal informant, tasked with gathering concrete evidence of Augusto's group's activities. Theodore would provide me with equipment, like a miniature camera disguised as a brooch, a recorder the size of a matchbox, and materials for copying documents. We've been tracking suspicious patterns for years: irregular financial transactions, unauthorized meetings, targeted recruitment, but we've never managed to gather solid evidence, only rumors and hints. He locked his gaze on mine. "Would you be willing to help us find this evidence, Teresina?" We agreed on a communication system. Encoded messages were left in specific locations, and discreet meetings were arranged through the existing network of women. Theodore introduced me as his granddaughter to justify any public interactions we might have. My heart racing, I changed direction, pretending to admire the artwork in the hallway as I made my way to the indicated room. The music room was empty, lit only by a distant lamp, while the instruments were covered with cloths to protect them from dust. I sat down at the closed piano, pretending to admire the wood finish. "Just with my embroidery," I replied, showing the hoop, and I rested a bit. That headache, you know. He didn't push further, but I felt that something was wrong. A man who stood by certain principles that also guide true Freemasonry: brotherhood, mutual support, the quest for knowledge, and moral improvement. He paused meaningfully. "Unfortunately, not everyone who wears our symbols shares those values." The implication was clear. With my heart pounding, I pushed open the office door and stepped into the forbidden space. His scent filled the room. An expensive perfume, old paper, and leather. The walls were decorated with framed diplomas and photographs alongside politicians and businessmen, all discreetly wearing a golden brooch on their lapels. He wanted to separate Augusto and me, or vice versa. To my surprise, Augusto agreed. Maybe he didn't want to appear rude to a higher-ranking Mason, or perhaps he was curious about what Theodore wanted from him. I headed toward the library, but as soon as I turned the corner, I felt a presence behind me. It was Carmela, who had apparently followed me quietly. "Don't go to the library," she whispered. "Go to the music room. He'll be there in 5 minutes." There was no need to specify who he was. I understood immediately. June and her sick sister, as well as the medications I needed. He seemed to accept the explanation. However, there was something in the way his eyes scanned the room, as if searching for signs of something unusual. "Have you been busy while I was away?" The casual question hid a trap. We need authentic documents, not just copies. Recordings, not just testimonies. Evidence that can be brought before higher authorities, not local police or state courts, which are infiltrated, but federal agencies beyond their control. He went on to explain that there was an internal division within the Masonic organization. "It's a pleasure to see you on this special occasion," Augusto replied with his practiced politeness, though I noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. There was something between them, perhaps rivalry or distrust. After a few minutes of formal conversation, Theodore turned specifically to me. "Enjoy yourself and have a coffee at the bakery on me." Her smile was one of genuine gratitude. Small acts of kindness were rare in that house. As soon as she left, I rushed to Augusto's office, a sacred and forbidden place for me unless I was explicitly invited, which rarely happened. A leather-bound ledger, filled with pages written in a cipher I couldn't fully decode. Still, some terms stood out: merchandise, export, unit value, acceptable losses, along with dates, locations, and amounts. I strained to memorize the pattern of the ciphered writing, and in a reckless moment that could have cost me everything, I hid one of the photos in the sleeve of my dress. It was of a girl who had recently come to the shop, and I knew she would be next to escape. Evidence, concrete proof. "Mrs. Bastos, I heard you have exceptional taste in antiques. There's a piece in the mayor's library that might interest you, a 17th century Dutch pendulum clock. You should take a look while your husband and I discuss some lodge matters." It was a casual suggestion, but I immediately sensed what was at stake. I thought it was the maid coming back early, but the voice that echoed down the hall froze my blood. Augusto. He never came back ahead of schedule, never changed plans without warning. Something had happened. I forced a smile, trying to hide the tremble in my hands, praying the cold sweat trickling down my neck wouldn't show. "They are a minority," Theodore assured me, "but they wield power and influence and are extremely dangerous. We can't simply expel or denounce them without irrefutable proof. It would be our word against theirs, and many honest, legitimate brothers would side with them, deceived by their respectable facade." Then came a proposal as bold as it was risky. About a month after that incident, something happened that would completely change the course of my life. It was a reception at the mayor's residence, a formal dinner celebrating the opening of a new hospital, largely funded by the store owners. We were childhood friends in Pelotas. We went to the same school and played on the same soccer team. He was my wedding godfather, you know? I had no idea about that. My father never mentioned that connection. Theodore continued, now with a more serious look. "Your father was a man of honor, Teresina. I would record meetings, conversations, and transactions, take note of names, dates, amounts, and most importantly, try to obtain direct proof about the fate of the missing girls. It's an extremely risky mission," Theodore emphasized. "I totally understand if you choose not to cooperate. The risk is enormous. I'm already helping," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I've been documenting everything I can, but it's not enough." I had little time, at most 2 hours, before someone would return. I started with the desk. The drawers were locked, but I found the key hidden under a heavy paperweight, a set square, and a solid bronze compass. Initially, there was nothing unusual. Legitimate business documents, ordinary correspondence, office supplies. Next to the book, a brown envelope held photographs, dozens of them. Young girls, some I recognized from the shops, others I'd never seen before, all scantily dressed, posed suggestively, with vacant expressions that revealed they weren't there by choice. On the back of each photo, a number and a price like a catalog. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I closed the secret drawer, locked the desk, and left the office heart pounding. Barely had I returned to my sewing chair, pretending to be occupied with a piece of embroidery, when I heard the front door open. Augusto mingled among the prominent guests, radiating charm and feigned modesty about his contributions to the city's development, always keeping me by his side as usual, with a possessive hand on my waist, presenting me as his most precious flower. A particularly cruel joke, given what he did to things that were valuable. The door was locked, of course, but after years of being married to him, I'd learned a few tricks. I knew exactly where the spare key was hidden, tucked inside a disguised book in the library on the third shelf, among the bound volumes of commercial law that were never consulted. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "For some time now. We've had suspicions," he replied carefully, "about certain activities carried out by a specific group that calls itself a lodge, but operates outside our principles and rules. This group is led by your husband and some of his closest associates. You see, we need something more solid, something that even they, with all their connections, won't be able to cover up." Theodore nodded soberly. The echo of his footsteps in the hallway sounded like a countdown to my destruction. In desperation, I hid the camera and improvised, trying to act as if I were just rummaging through the desk drawers. When he walked into the office and saw me there, a place I shouldn't be without permission, I felt my blood run cold. "What are you doing here?" he asked, in a dangerously calm tone. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, anything to justify my presence. I replied that I was looking for that emerald necklace, forcing a sheepish smile. I wanted to wear it to dinner the next night, as a surprise. However, in the deepest drawer, something caught my eye. The bottom felt shallower than expected, given the depth of the drawer. I ran my fingers along the edges and noticed a slight bulge in one corner. I pressed it, and with a soft click, the false bottom lifted. What I found there made my blood run cold. So, in that dimly lit music room, we sealed an agreement that would change the course of our lives forever. The following months tested our courage and deceit. Using the equipment Theodore provided me, disguised as harmless gifts from a distant uncle, I began meticulously recording everything. I thought it might have been stored in his safe. It was a weak, unlikely excuse. Augusto studied me for long seconds, his eyes cold and calculating. To my surprise, his face finally broke into a condescending smile. "Ah, my dear, always so eager to please me. A catalog of lives for sale." I felt my stomach twist. I had to fight the urge to vomit and risk blowing everything. With shaking hands, I jotted down as much as I could in a small notebook I'd brought. I recorded names, dates, and values. Theodore listened closely, his expression growing heavier. When I finished, he sighed deeply, as if carrying a great burden. "It's worse than we thought," he admitted. I shared about my secret diary, the observations I've been recording, about the network of wives who were also aware of what's happening. I mentioned the book of coded records I discovered, the photographs, the detailed system for transporting and trafficking young women. I photographed documents whenever Augusto left the office unlocked, recorded conversations during dinners and meetings at our home, and copied pages from the coded ledger whenever I had the chance. It was a slow, meticulous, and terrifying task. Every moment felt like a walk on a razor's edge. Each image was a risk of discovery. Each recording, a potential death sentence. I experienced moments of sheer panic, like that afternoon in Augusto's office when I was photographing a new batch of catalogs I had found and heard the front door open. He had returned earlier than expected. He watched me closely, gauging my reaction. "The question is, Teresina, what do you know about these activities?" It was a pivotal moment. Should I trust him or not? It could be a trap, a way for Augusto to test my loyalty. I was there, of course, playing my usual role as a trophy wife, dressed in an elegant outfit, sparkling accessories, and a practiced smile. "If you're discovered, I can't guarantee your safety. Augusto and his allies wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any threat to their plan." He didn't need to say more. I knew exactly what those men were capable of. "I understand the risks," I replied, "but I also know what will happen if no one takes action." I waited for the explosion, the accusation, the punishment, but nothing happened. Maybe it was just paranoia on my part, or perhaps he was simply waiting, watching, and gathering more evidence before acting. Augusto had always been patient in his cruelty. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed he was watching my sleeve, exactly where I had hidden the photograph, now transcribed in my secret diary inside the Bible. Had I left any mark, any suspicious crease? Fear consumed me for days, even weeks. It was at this event that he approached. An elderly gentleman with pure white hair, wearing a golden Masonic brooch, but with a somewhat unique design. I recognized Theodore Vasconcelos. I had only seen him from afar before. He was a respected figure in the town, a longtime friend of my father's. But there was something in Theodore's eyes, genuine compassion, and honesty that couldn't be faked, that made me decide to open up. I know about the young women, I finally admitted. I'm aware they don't run away. I know where they are being taken and why. The words poured out like a flood, breaking years of forced silence. He had been invited to the reception as a representative of the Grand Lodge, the highest authority of traditional masonry in the state. Mr. and Mrs. Bastos, he greeted with an almost old-fashioned formality. We're expanding operations to Acre, on the Bolivian border. Every word confirmed more of the horror we already knew. Every sentence was another piece for the case we were building. After dinner, when the men moved to the living room to enjoy drinks and cigars, the atmosphere changed. And depending on how she behaved there, she might face the same fate as Linda, or worse, be taken to that rural estate where quicklime would erase her existence. It was at that moment that I came up with the boldest plan of all, a plan that could end the scheme once and for all, or cost me my life. She would never be in real danger. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. In the days leading up to the meeting, I grew closer to Rosie. I visited her often at the store, talked with her, trying to earn her trust. She was perceptive and attentive. The horrifying revelation left me sick for days, but it also steeled my determination. This wasn't just about exposing a crime ring. It was literally a race against death. Every day the operation stayed active meant more lives lost, more bodies in unmarked graves. What would you have done in my place? I saw the exact moment understanding dawned in her eyes, the moment she realized she wasn't there just to serve drinks, but that she herself was the object of the transaction. Panic showed in her gaze as her body began to tremble slightly. Then everything happened in the blink of an eye. She walked over to the hidden safe behind a picture, opened it with the combination she never shared with me, and took out the necklace in question. Here it is. Next time, just ask. You know I don't like people messing with my things. I narrowly escaped, but that incident was a warning sign. We were fully aware that we were putting Rosie in danger, the very girl I wanted to protect. The bitter irony did not escape me, but Theodore assured me that nothing serious would happen to her. We'll intervene before anything escalates, he promised. At the first sign of physical aggression, we would step in. Risk your own life to save strangers, or protect yourself and stay silent? There are no easy answers. Every choice comes with serious consequences. Share in the comments what you would do if you discovered your partner was involved in something so horrifying, because remember, this isn't just a hypothetical for many women. He finally agreed. We could test it at the next meeting. The special gathering next week would be the perfect opportunity. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The special meeting would take place at our house, which was unusual, as these usually happened in more remote locations. I was thinking this new girl, Rosie, seems to have the potential to be more than just a simple saleswoman. Maybe I could bring her to help me here at home during receptions. It would be nice to have a young, attractive assistant to impress the guests. Augusto looked at me suspiciously. You have no idea what you've done. Maybe you didn't know. Maybe you were just beginning to grasp the enormity of what we had unleashed. But for the first time in many years, I felt no fear. Instead, I felt something else. Something I had almost forgotten. Freedom. The certainty that no matter what happened next, I would never again be a prisoner of that man, that house, that life of lies and hidden horrors. And that certainty, That vision of a different future was worth any risk. The hours following Augusto's arrest were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and surprisingly, relief. "You're different from the other bosses' wives," she once said when we were alone. "There's something in your eyes, like you're always on guard." Her sharpness unsettled me. If she could see through my mask, others could too. "It's just fatigue," I deflected, forcing a smile. What he didn't know was that Theodore and his group were already aware of this visit, having identified the visitor as a notorious human trafficker wanted in 3 states, and they were monitoring our home that night, ready to record everything. "Was it you?" I didn't have time to answer. The front door was blown open. Armed agents stormed in. Theodore was among them, not the gentle old man anymore, but a figure radiating undeniable authority. He introduced himself as a special agent with the federal police, assigned to an operation against human trafficking. An unexpected opportunity came with the arrival of Rosie, a 16-year-old girl from a small town near the Santa Catarina border, slim, with long black hair and big, expressive eyes. But it wasn't her looks that caught my attention, it was her spirit. I rarely offered suggestions about his business, but the idea seemed to pique his interest. A beautiful young woman serving drinks in our home would be yet another symbol of his power and success, and, more importantly, it would place her even more firmly under his control. An intriguing proposal. It happened almost by chance. I was reviewing some recordings I made during a dinner at our house when I heard a conversation between Augusto and another brother, Dr. Mendez, discussing a farm on the outskirts of town. "Is the place secure?" Augusto asked. "Completely," Mendez replied, "isolated far from the main roads." Augusto introduced him as our business partner from the Midwest, but everyone there already knew his real role in the operation. I watched as his eyes followed Rosie around the room, appraising her like a horse at an auction. Augusto motioned for Rosie to join them and serve cognac. As usual, I should have quietly excused myself. Wives didn't participate in this part of the evening, but this time, defying all the unspoken rules, I stayed. "Let me help with the drinks, dear," I said with my most charming smile. I asked Theodore as soon as we found a moment of privacy, sitting in the kitchen while agents continued their work throughout the rest of the house. He let out a deep sigh, the exhaustion of months, perhaps years, of investigation clear on his weathered face. "Now comes the hardest part," he answered honestly. Not out of empathy, I realized, but because he preferred to handle this kind of business with more discretion. That was the signal Theodore had been waiting for. Seconds later, we heard sirens, many sirens, approaching quickly, red and blue lights flashing through the windows. Voices blared over loudspeakers. However, one crucial piece was missing. Direct evidence, not just circumstantial, proving that the young girls were being forced against their will, abused, and trafficked. This was the most difficult and dangerous link in the chain of evidence. I showed her how to serve drinks, where to stand, and how to behave, and quietly fastened a bracelet around her wrist. "It's a gift from me," I said. In truth, a hidden microphone was linked to Theodore's devices and his team, who were watching everything from a van 2 blocks away. Maybe not in such complex human trafficking schemes, but in other forms of crime, violence, and horrors that happen behind closed doors. Silence always protects the monsters. By that point, we had already gathered substantial evidence, photos of documents, incriminating recordings, names, dates, amounts, transport routes. No one goes there for years, except when necessary. There was something about the way he said, "when necessary," that sent chills down my spine. "And what about the previous remains?" Augusto inquired. "They're well taken care of. Quicklime works wonders, my friend. Leaves no trace." But this time, the brothers from the parallel store were expecting an important visitor coming from Sao Paulo, someone who was apparently key to their national network. And Augusto, always eager to impress, had offered to host the event. The life of the wife of an important man isn't as glamorous as it seems. When I told her about the opportunity to help with the reception at our house, her eyes lit up. It would be an honor, Mrs. Teresina. Her genuine excitement broke my heart. She had no idea what awaited her. For a moment, I almost gave up on the plan. The house was raided by agents, with every room carefully searched, documents confiscated, and safes forced open. Theodore stood by my side the entire time, a steady and reassuring presence while I gave my initial statement, trying to condense years of horror into clear testimonies. Outside, police vehicles flashed their lights, and curious neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, trying to make sense of what had happened at the Bastos mansion, the model couple of Porto Alegre's high society. "What happens now?" "Dear," Augusto said a few days later, wearing the best expression I could manage. I positioned myself strategically in a corner of the room, organizing bottles and glasses, always alert to everything around me. I saw when the guest from Sao Paulo called Rosie over, pretending not to notice as he asked for more cognac. I watched his hand slide around her waist, moving slowly upward. Augusto smiled, that cold smile I knew all too well. "She's special, still in training, you understand. Maybe in the next batch." The man's expression turned dissatisfied. I nearly asked Theodore to find another way, not to use an innocent girl as a pawn in our dangerous game. But what choice did we have? How many other Rosies, Lindas, and Mariahs would keep disappearing if we didn't act? On the night of the meeting, everything was perfectly arranged. Augusto Bastos, the man who destroyed so many lives, including mine, being handcuffed, read his rights, treated like the criminal he truly was. For a moment our eyes met. The hatred in his gaze was so intense, so pure, that I recoiled without thinking. "You're dead," his eyes silently said. I noticed the discomfort on the girl's face, how she tried to gently pull away. "How much for this one?" he asked Augusto directly, still holding Rosie by the arm. The young woman seemed of good quality, attractive, with that air of innocence that northern buyers prized so much. As the evening went on and the guests, all men, arrived, each wearing a gold brooch on their lapel, all showing that same predatory look I recognized so well, the tension rose. The visitor from Sao Paulo was a sturdy, middle-aged man, adorned with flashy jewelry and a smile that never reached his eyes. I needed to be even more cautious, even more meticulous. Any mistake could mean not just my death, but the collapse of the entire operation, the end of that horrific scheme that had already destroyed so many lives. During this time, she uncovered the darkest aspect of the whole operation, the fate of the troubled young girls. Throughout dinner, I stayed at the table as always, the perfect hostess, smiling, serving, and barely engaging in conversation. But my ears were alert, catching fragments of whispered talks. The blonde from last month was well received. The price justified the transport. Rosie arrived early, impressed by the mansion and the elegant preparations. She wore a simple but lovely dress I had picked out, deliberately more modest than the provocative outfits usually forced on girls at such events. "I can offer a higher price. I have a buyer in mind, an influential politician from Manaus. He pays well for new arrivals." The negotiation continued cold and calculated, while Rosie stood there confused and terrified, beginning to realize something was very wrong. He showed a search warrant and ordered everyone to stay where they were. I saw Rosie being escorted by an agent, wrapped in a blanket, crying but safe. And finally, after so many years of terror, constant fear, and helplessness, I witnessed something I never thought I would see. The presence of Rosie, young, beautiful, and vulnerable, would serve as the perfect bait. The men would inevitably harass her, size her up, and perhaps even start negotiations right then and there. And all of this would be captured by strategically placed cameras and recorders. It was an extremely risky plan. I wanted to make sure our distinguished guest would be impressed by our hospitality. Augusto gave me an annoyed look, but he couldn't make a scene in front of the guests. He nodded stiffly and turned his attention back to the conversation. The implication was chilling and unmistakable. The girls who resisted too much, caused trouble, or threatened to expose the scheme weren't just trafficked away. They were eliminated, executed, and buried on that remote farm, their bodies dissolved in lime to erase any evidence. "This Rosie is a special girl," he said, after his first visit to the shop where she worked. "She has a fire, a presence that the others don't." I recognized that tone, that sharp gaze all too well. Rosie would become the next to be selected for a special meeting. "Federal police! The house is surrounded! Come out with your hands up!" Chaos erupted. Men ran, trying to escape through the back, only to run into more agents. Augusto, frozen in shock, stared at me with a look of sudden, terrifying understanding. "You!" he whispered, his voice thick with resentment. She carried a determination, a vibrant intelligence that immediately reminded me of Linda. The same sparkle in her eyes, the same conviction that the future would bring change, the same toughness. Just like Linda, Rosie also quickly caught Augusto's attention. Theodore was meticulously building the case, getting ready to present it to the federal authorities and the legitimate leaders of Freemasonry. The guest, growing impatient, pulled Rosie onto his lap, ignoring her silent protests. His large hand covered her mouth when she tried to scream. "Shall we test the merchandise first? What do you say?" he suggested with a vulgar laugh. The other men laughed along, silent accomplices. Augusto looked uncomfortable. The thought of living alone, facing the world without any support, was terrifying at that moment. Over time, the shop began to gain recognition. It wasn't the largest or most profitable in the city, but it was respected for its careful curation and the authentic knowledge displayed about each item. It wasn't full justice, but it was more than most women in my situation could hope for. The rebuilding process was long, painful, full of setbacks and moments of despair. There were days when I could barely get out of bed, when the weight of memories was so overwhelming that breathing felt like an effort. Some might already be dead, others unrecognizable after years of abuse. Some may never be found. "We've started searches at all properties and addresses mentioned in the seized documents," Theodore said. "At first, it was just a hobby, a way to fill my days and reconnect with something that truly fascinated me. I traveled through the countryside, attending auctions and visiting old sites and farms, always searching for interesting items. But it's a complicated operation that will take time, and we have to act carefully to prevent those involved who escaped from destroying evidence or eliminating witnesses." That night, I tried to sleep in a discreet hotel downtown, guarded by federal agents. There were only vague mentions of an operation against human trafficking and the arrest of suspects, without names or detailed information. The influence of the real Masonic order, combined with the power of those involved, ensured the case did not receive the public attention it deserved. The organization spanned several states and involved politicians, business leaders, judges, powerful people willing to do anything to cover up the case and protect their names and reputations. The legitimate Freemasonry is also concerned about limiting the public scandal, he admitted. After so many years living under absolute control, sudden freedom was almost as frightening as captivity. I had no home, no financial resources. All the accounts and assets were in Augusto's name. I had no profession or skills to support myself. Though only 27, I felt like an old woman, worn down, broken, irreparably damaged. So far, we had managed to rescue 17 women who had been held on isolated farms in Mato Grosso and Rondonia. My heart raced. "Linda?" I asked, barely able to hold on to hope. Theodore noticed my anxiety, and a faint smile appeared on his face. I found out I enjoyed reading not just light novels meant for ladies, but also heavier literature, philosophy, and history. I realized I had thoughts about politics, art, and the world beyond the walls of the mansion where I had spent so many years imprisoned. On other days, a simple noise would make me jump, convinced that Augusto had escaped, that he was coming to fulfill his death threat. I began therapy, something revolutionary at that time, especially for a woman. I started attracting a regular clientele: collectors, decorators, history enthusiasts, tourists looking for souvenirs more meaningful than the usual trinkets. And even more importantly, I began building a life that was truly my own. He looked even more exhausted than the night before, but there was a satisfaction in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "We have news," he said as soon as he entered the room. Several simultaneous operations had taken place in different regions of the country overnight. There was comfort in being with someone who understood perfectly what I had been through, someone who didn't need explanations or justifications for the night terrors, the flinching at every noise, or the panic attacks for no apparent reason. She was among them, alive, though badly injured, both physically and emotionally, but alive. Tears spilled uncontrollably. After all those years, and so many nights spent wondering what had happened to her, if she was alive, if she was suffering, finally, an answer. Not the Teresina who was Augusto's wife, the well-dressed doll who smiled and waved at social events, but the real Teresina, the girl from Pelotas who had dreams, interests, and opinions before all of that was suppressed by control and fear. What mattered, he said, was that the organization had been dismantled. The network was exposed. The main operatives were identified, even if some managed to avoid arrest. They could no longer operate as before. To me, the future felt like a terrifying unknown. She recounted the years of captivity on a remote farm in northern Mato Grosso, where she was held with other women under appalling conditions. She spoke of the daily abuses she suffered, the failed escape attempts, and the despair that nearly consumed her. A modest, low-profile life without the luxuries or social status of before, but infinitely richer in freedom and authenticity. Around 1962, about 3 years after Augusto's downfall, I received a visit that would change everything once again. Not yet. She and the others are receiving medical and psychological care. Many of them are in shock, distrustful of everything and everyone. It will take time for them to feel safe again. He was right, of course. Not just any answer, but the best I could have hoped for given the circumstances. "Can I see her?" I asked through sobs. Theodore shook his head. As much as I wanted to see Linda, hug her, and apologize for not being able to protect her, I understood she needed space, specialized treatment, and time to process everything she had been through. The mansion felt isolated, like a crime scene, and there was no way I could ever sleep again within those walls that had witnessed so much horror. Lying on that strange bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through my body, keeping me in a constant state of alertness, waiting any moment to hear Augusto's voice or feel his hand gripping my arm. My body would take a while to realize that it was truly free. The next morning, Theodore came to get me, and I recognized a passion that had been dormant inside me since childhood, a love for antiques. I had always been fascinated by objects from the past, by the stories they carried and the lives they had witnessed. As the daughter of a railway worker, I grew up surrounded by interesting items my father sometimes brought home. When we finally pulled apart, I closed the shop. It didn't matter if I lost sales that day. We went up to my small apartment. I made some tea. We sat at the kitchen table, and then she began to share her story. The therapist recommended by Theodore was a kind and understanding man who helped me see that my feelings, the constant fear, nightmares, and flashbacks, were not signs of weakness or madness, but normal reactions to extraordinary trauma. Over time, very slowly, I began to rediscover who Teresina really was. But given the circumstances, we can negotiate fairly favorable terms. And that's what happened. By threatening to publicly expose all the details of the criminal scheme, which would not only destroy Augusto, but also implicate his family and partners, we reached an agreement that ensured I received a significant share of his fortune and assets. Not out of complicity, but to prevent the entire institution from being sullied by the actions of a few criminals who misuse our symbols. And then there were the young women, dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across remote parts of the country, kept in conditions close to slavery. The emotion was overwhelming, a lump in my throat making it impossible to speak. After all those years, after countless nights wondering if she was still alive, if she was suffering, if she blamed me for not protecting her, there she was, standing whole and alive. We embraced, both of us breaking down in tears. She smiled a different smile than I remembered, more reserved, more mature, yet still carrying that hint of determination that had impressed me years before. "Hello, Mrs. Teresina," she replied. "Or should I say Mrs. Teca now, since I saw that's what they call you around here?" I couldn't respond right away. When I finally received my share of the financial settlement, a significant amount for that time, I immediately knew what I wanted to do. I bought a small shop in the historic heart of Porto Alegre, a charming two-story building with large glass windows and a wooden floor that creaked warmly. It was Carmela who first offered me help. "Come stay with me," she said a few days after the operation. "My husband is in jail as an accomplice. The house is empty except for me. We can support each other as we try to rebuild our lives." I accepted gratefully. The operation had succeeded. We had caught the main suspects red-handed, with solid evidence. But this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. He explained that the network was even larger than we had imagined. Old clocks from abandoned stations, ornate lanterns from decommissioned carriages, small artifacts from a not-so-distant past, yet almost forgotten. Augusto clearly mocked my interest. He called it junk whenever I mentioned an antique piece I had spotted in a store window or at a friend's house. As she spoke, I noticed that she was fiddling with something hanging around her neck, a delicate chain with what appeared to be an old pocket watch. Noticing my gaze, she smiled and took the object, placing it on the table between us. "Do you recognize it?" she asked. It was a rainy autumn afternoon, one of those days when few customers ventured out on the streets. I was cataloging some newly acquired pieces when the doorbell rang, signaling someone's arrival. I looked up and could barely recognize the woman standing there. Victorian furniture, English porcelain, wall clocks, vintage toys, everyday objects that told stories from past eras. I learned about periods, styles, and restoration techniques. I read books and spoke with experts. I taught myself how to distinguish genuine from fake, valuable from merely old. Theodore also stayed by my side, helping me handle the legal and practical challenges that came with my new reality. The most urgent priority was the divorce, an almost impossible process in Brazil during the 1960s, especially for a woman. "Separation is the most viable option we can legally pursue," he explained. "When she's ready," Theodore continued, "and if she wishes to see you, we will arrange the meeting, but that decision has to be hers." In the following days, the operation continued to unfold. More arrests were made, although some of the more influential individuals managed to escape, at least for the time being. Augusto was held in a federal penitentiary far from Porto Alegre to prevent his local connections from aiding an escape or granting him special treatment. "What kept me alive," she said, her eyes fixed on the cup of tea, "was the promise I made to my mother that I would return, that I would send money, and that one day I would become a teacher." She swallowed hard, clearly holding back tears. "Even in the darkest moments when I thought I couldn't bear another day, I clung to that promise. And when the rescue finally came, it felt like a dream. I couldn't believe it was real, that I was finally free." After the rescue, Linda spent months recovering, both physically and emotionally. When she finally felt ready to search for her family, she discovered that her mother had passed away 2 years earlier, never having known what really happened to her daughter. The younger siblings were placed with relatives, and the house had to be sold to settle debts. There was nowhere to go back to, she explained. So I decided to start over from scratch. I finished my studies. I now have my high school diploma, and I'm in my first year of teacher training school. God willing, next year I will be a primary school teacher. But young women were found and rescued. some in such dire conditions that they could barely walk or speak. The media began investigating the story, but the coverage was surprisingly limited and superficial. Her hair was shorter than usual. She wore simple framed glasses, and her modest clothes were well kept. It took me a few moments to process it. "Linda," I asked, my voice trembling, hardly able to believe it. Theodore assured me he would face justice and pay for his actions, but he also acknowledged that, given the nature of our judicial system and the resources Augusto had, it was impossible to predict how long he would remain imprisoned or if he would serve his full sentence. Upstairs, I made a small apartment for myself, simple and cozy, full of natural light, the opposite of the cold, ostentatious mansion where I had lived for so many years. On the ground floor, I opened Memories of Yesterday, my antique store. "You were also a victim. You did what you could in the impossible circumstances you were in, and in the end, helped save many lives, including mine." Your eyes met mine, determined as always. What do these small acts, added up by thousands, even millions of women throughout history become? They ultimately dismantle entire systems of abuse and oppression. Linda's clock may have stopped, but time hasn't. They need to be heard. They must be remembered, so other women know they are not alone in their struggles. Click now, listen, and join us in this chain of women who, across generations, support one another. Information was exchanged through seemingly innocent letters, product orders containing coded messages, and travelers who spread news orally. It was a slow and imperfect system, but surprisingly effective in an era without the internet, cell phones, or the fast communication tools we have today. Just a group of women helping other women, using the same codes, the same secret language we developed years ago to survive. A butterfly brooch meant, "I am trustworthy, you can speak." A clear request for that old watch displayed in the window meant the person needed urgent help. That was the only thing I managed to take with me. Over all these years, it was my only link to reality, to who I was before. I held the watch in my hands, stunned. I never imagined my mother had such an object, let alone that she intended to give it to me. When I opened the lid, I noticed a small photo glued inside. Anonymity was our shield, our strength. We were just harmless old ladies, selling antiques, knitting, and chatting about the weather. Who would suspect that behind this image lay a network of resistance and rescue? Augusto served only 8 of the 15 years he was sentenced. To accomplish this, we created a communication network among merchants from different cities, antique dealers, bookstores, craft shops, and small businesses usually run by women or men who supported our cause. Every time a woman quietly says this is not right while her partner shouts, every time a young woman tells herself, "My body is mine," while unwanted hands touch her, every time a victim decides not to stay silent any longer, that is an act of resistance, maybe small and unnoticed by others, but nevertheless powerful. Sometimes I wonder if I've done enough, if I could have saved more lives, helped more people, or contributed more to changing the system that allows these abuses to persist. But then I remember Linda's words from so many years ago, "Don't carry guilt that isn't yours." It was a silver watch decorated with the initials JA engraved on the lid. I frowned, not understanding. "It belonged to her father," she explained, "Joachim Alcanter. He gave it to her mother before he passed away, and she kept it for you. At the moment everything happened, she had it in the pocket of her dress." Over the years that followed, we stayed in touch. Linda finished her studies and became a primary school teacher in Caxias do Sul, later becoming the principal of a small rural school. She married a good man, a widowed farmer with 2 young children, who loved her and respected her history, her traumas, and her limits. However, throughout my long life, I've learned that fear can be overcome. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, day by day, with small acts of courage at every step. Over the years, I helped find more than 100 people. Some were alive, But sadly, many had already passed away, and others were in such dire conditions that their rescue seemed almost impossible. Each victory was quietly celebrated, each loss privately mourned. We did not seek public recognition. We didn't want headlines or medals. Not as quickly as I should have. If I had been braver before, maybe you and many others wouldn't have gone through that hell. Linda reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "Don't blame yourself," she said firmly. "For all who turn their pain into purpose, their trauma into strength, their scars into badges of honor. I am Teresina Alcantara Bastos, also known as the Antique Store Donor. This is the story I kept hidden for so many decades. I never founded a famous institution." A cup of tea offered, quietly said, "This is a safe space to talk." As time went on, we broadened our efforts. It wasn't just about escaping abusive husbands anymore, although that was still a vital part of our work. My parents, young and smiling on their wedding day. A wave of emotion washed over me. My parents had passed away a few years ago, never knowing the truth about my marriage, not understanding why I distanced myself. And now, this small part of them was returning to me through Linda. "I came to return it," she said. They came seeking advice, guidance, and sometimes just an understanding ear. Little by little, almost without realizing it, I created an informal support network. It wasn't a formal organization. It had no official name or legal status. "Don't carry guilt that's not yours, Mrs. Teca. We already have enough burdens without taking on those that aren't ours." When Linda said her goodbyes that afternoon, she left her watch in my hands, despite my protests. "Now it's hers, as it always should have been," she insisted. I never made headlines, but quietly, with the patience of an antiquarian, I helped locate over 100 people over time. If you want to hear more stories from women who faced the impossible and won, subscribe to the Vovos do Brasil channel. Because while men documented official history, we seemingly harmless old ladies were behind the scenes rewriting fate. Before you go, notice the little squares appearing on your screen now. Click on them to hear more stories from women like me, warriors who endured terrible situations but found the strength to survive and help others. Every click is a voice that refuses to be silenced. Every story is proof that even in the darkest circumstances, there is a path to freedom. Don't let these stories fade away. The freedom I had fought for at such a great cost was far too precious to be limited, even in part. I found family ties in alternative ways, among the women in the network, among protégés who became friends, in the children of these women who grew up calling me Tia Teca. We collaborate with official bodies, NGOs, and specialized police units that didn't even exist when we started. The world has transformed, the tools have changed, but the heart of our work remains constant. Women supporting women survivors, offering help to those still caught in abusive and exploitative situations. The world has changed, the tools have evolved, but the core of our mission remains the same. Women supporting other women survivors, reaching out to those still trapped in abusive and exploitative situations. The story continues to be written not only by the strong, the official victors, but also by us, the survivors, the resilient, those who refuse to be silenced. For every woman who confronted fear head-on and, despite her doubts, took a step forward. For each one who reached out to another and whispered, "You are not alone." Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, one day at a time, one small, courageous step at a time. Decent, kind, and understanding men accepted my traumas and limits. Yet, I never felt the need or desire to formalize those relationships. My freedom, won at such a high cost, was too precious to compromise, even a little. I found a new sense of family in other ways, among the women in the network, in protégés who became friends, and in their children who grew up calling me Tia Teca. And after Voteca, the network remains active today, even though it has adapted over time. Now we use cell phones, emails, and instant messaging. It isolates us, and convinces us that we're alone in our pain, that no one will believe us, that there's no way out. Fear is the perfect prison, invisible, portable, and self-imposed. But throughout my long life, I've learned it can be overcome. It makes us doubt ourselves, our perception of reality, our right to safety and dignity, isolating us and convincing us that we are alone in our suffering, that no one will believe us, that there is no way out. The fear is the perfect prison, invisible, portable, self-imposed. He was released from prison in 1968, a man still relatively young, but without the power and influence he once held. Good men, kind and patient with my traumas and limitations, but the need or desire to formalize those relationships never occurred to me. I did what I could with the resources available and the circumstances I was in, and maybe that's all any of us can do. Fear silences. It's the most powerful and effective weapon, instilling doubt about ourselves, about what's real, and about our right to safety and dignity. I never got rich, nor did I want to, but I earned enough to live comfortably and independently. Over time, the shop became more than just a business. It turned into a meeting place. Women in vulnerable situations began coming to me, discreetly referred by Carmela, Linda, and others who knew my story. I did what I could with the resources available and the circumstances I faced, and maybe that's all any of us can really do. Fear silences us. It is its most powerful and effective weapon. We also supported women in finding employment, accessing education, and obtaining legal representation when necessary. And perhaps most importantly, we helped locate missing persons, especially women and girls who had been forcibly taken, sold, or exploited. They had 2 more children together. She never forgot the horror she endured, but she didn't let it define her whole life either. Every Christmas, I received a card from her, always with a butterfly drawn in the corner, always signed with the words, "Together we are stronger." As for me, the antique shop prospered modestly. And also to thank you. I know you tried to protect me back then. I acknowledge that you risked a lot. And later, when the rescue happened, we were told you were crucial in dismantling the entire network. I shook my head, feeling uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I didn't do enough," I replied. Sometimes I wonder if I did enough, if I could have saved more lives, helped more people, contributed more to changing the system that allows such abuses to happen. But then I remember Linda's words from so many years ago, "Don't carry the guilt that isn't yours." Besides that, I have something even more meaningful to remind me where I come from and where I'm headed. She showed me a small brooch pinned to the lapel of her simple coat, a silver butterfly, the same symbol Carmela and the other women in the secret network wore. "Together, we are stronger," she always said. And later, Teca. The network remains active to this day, though it has evolved over time. Now we use cell phones, emails, and instant messaging. We collaborate with official organizations, NGOs, and specialized police departments that didn't exist when we began. How mistaken I was. In the few times we were alone, he always kept a respectful distance, unlike other guys I had met. It surprised me. A true gentleman, I thought. Today, I recognize it was a strategy. He was sizing me up, studying me like someone inspects a product before making a purchase. He owned Tecidos Finos Bastos, the most elegant store in town, which already had branches in Rio Grande and was beginning to expand into Porto Alegre. A striking figure, always dressed in a tailored suit and shoes so polished you could see your reflection in them. And I smiled, thanked, served drinks and snacks, acting as the perfect hostess he expected me to be. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Augusto went out for what he called business meetings. I was married to a man who now had full rights over me, according to the law, the church, and society. I thought about running away, seeking help from my parents, but quickly dismissed the idea. My father idolized Augusto, and my mother always said marital problems should be solved between husband and wife. Teresina, the loving and charming wife. At parties, he made a point of introducing me as the best decision he ever made, squeezing my arm hard enough to leave marks. I smiled because I had learned that not smiling meant an even worse punishment when we got home. But dreaming big wasn't really something for people like us. I studied as much as I could. I helped my mother with sewing jobs, and my pastime was reading borrowed magazines and walking in the square on Sundays after Mass. It was on one of those Sundays that Augusto Bastos first noticed me. Augusto was 34 years old. They greeted him in a strange, almost reverential way. One of them, an elderly man named Theodore, gave me a look I now recognize as compassion. At the moment, I thought it was just emotion because of the occasion. Our honeymoon took place in Gramado, an elegant destination at the time. Little do they know I learned to notice the details, to read between the lines, when my life depended on it. Today, I am respected, greeted on the street, invited to community events. We returned to Pelotas and settled in his house, a mansion in the city's best neighborhood, decorated with imported furniture and staffed by 3 employees. In the first few weeks, Augusto introduced me to his social circle. Other merchants, some lawyers, the mayor, the judge, all prominent men, all wearing that same lapel pin. When I mentioned that she seemed too young for such a task, I received a slap so hard that I fell to the kitchen floor. "Mind your own business," he said with terrifying calm. "I know exactly what I'm doing." On the night of the meeting, I saw Linda being led by one of the employees, wearing an outfit that made her look older. Our eyes met for a brief moment, full of fear. The next morning, I found Linda in the back room where she slept. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly into the distance. As I approached, I noticed purple bruises on her neck, partly hidden by a scarf. Her eyes were red from crying. "What happened?" I asked, already dreading the answer. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face again. "The boss and his friends aren't who they appear to be," she whispered at last. I tried to wrap her in a hug, assuring her that everything would be all right, but the words sounded empty, even to me. Even Augusto, the most sought-after man in town, taking an interest in our Teresina. My dad puffed up with pride whenever my boyfriend was mentioned. My mom started teaching me special recipes, insisting that winning a man's heart was all about pleasing his stomach. And I, so naive, felt like I was Cinderella herself. Besides, where would I go? With what money? Augusto controlled every penny and every aspect of my life. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He even gave me a gift, an extremely expensive pearl necklace. It was the first time I realized that gifts could become chains. The pattern was quickly set. I've heard similar stories from Manaus to Porto Alegre, and it makes me realize I haven't been alone on this journey. Share in the comments where you're from and if you know of any women who disappeared without a trace. Back then, for a young girl from a humble background like me, the daughter of a railway worker, the future was almost predetermined. Get married and have children. If I was lucky, I'd find a husband who didn't drink too much and didn't hit the kids. If I was really lucky, he wouldn't be violent with me either. When I found the first secret diary at the summer house, filled with notes about shipped goods and discarded defective items, something inside me died because I knew, deep down, these young women hadn't simply run off with the jewelry, as he claimed. About a year after the wedding, Augusto announced his new charity project. He would bring young people from the countryside, from needy families, to work in his stores and have opportunities for study and personal growth. His voice was soft, and his gaze seemed to look right through you to the soul, and that golden brooch on his lapel, the meaning of which I would only understand much later. When he began courting me, sending flowers to my house, and accidentally showing up where I usually was, my family was in a tizzy. Just imagine, mister. About a month after Linda's arrival, Augusto announced a special meeting at his store. That's what he called the group of men who wore brooches like his. Some selected female employees were to serve food and drinks at the event. Linda was among them. And the most painful part of all, the world saw me as the luckiest woman in Pelotas. My name is Teresina Alcantara Bastos, but here in Porto Alegre, I'm known as Dona Teca from the antique shop. A program for underprivileged communities, he told the local newspapers, which praised him as a visionary, a true benefactor. To me, he explained that I would be responsible for guiding these young women, teaching them good manners and overseeing their work and studies. It's important to remember that these mysteries lie buried across Brazil, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. And today, with all the experience I've gained, I have nothing left to lose. What could they possibly do to me at this stage of my life? Alcantara going out to dinner at a fancy restaurant, being courted by a man like him, it felt like a fairy tale coming to life right before my eyes. Our relationship was brief, lasting only 3 months. Augusto used to say that a real man doesn't mess around. He decides, and that's it. I found that charming, a display of love. It wasn't just an accessory. It symbolized the power he held, the empire of horrors he built beneath a mask of smiles and polite greetings. The young women who vanished one after another followed a disturbing pattern. They were all young, full of dreams, and without families to ask uncomfortable questions. Everyone praised him, laughed at his jokes, agreed with his opinions, and I felt special for being by his side. The wedding took place on a sunny morning in April. I wore a dress that had belonged to my mother, altered and modernized by the seamstresses at his shop. Augusto seemed pleased, but not exactly happy. I've been through so much. I've escaped the worst, and there are still many people who believe certain truths should remain hidden. It was 1957. I was 19 years old, and Pelotas was one of those towns where everyone knew each other. Or at least that's what we thought. A charming little city, but very conservative. They would live in housing built behind the stores with all the necessary facilities. At the time, I believed it was a truly noble project. I even thought Augusto might be changing, awakening compassion. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first young woman arrived 2 weeks later. Her name was Linda. At the time, I attributed it to his natural seriousness and the weight of the responsibilities he carried. Today, I realize that for him, it was just a transaction, another property acquired. During the ceremony, several men I had never met before wore the same type of brooch as Augusto's, a square and compass crossed. Their secrets so heavy they can bend us long before we reach old age. I've carried one of those for decades. That golden brooch, adorned with a square and compass, that my husband wore pinned to his blazer. When I saw it, I felt frozen. And I, naive, mistook that cold and analytical gaze for admiration. At our engagement, there was a small but sophisticated celebration at the parish hall, and he gifted me a set of jewelry that left all the guests speechless. It was the first time I noticed the power he had over people. As if I had been chosen by God to live a life I could never have imagined even in my wildest dreams. When Augusto picked me up in his impressive Chevrolet at a time when owning a car was already a luxury, I could feel the gazes following us down the street. The daughter of Mr. Any small mistake on my part, a meal he didn't like, a word out of place, a glance he saw as a challenge, led to violence. After that came the gifts, the false kindness, and sometimes even empty apologies. And in public, we were the perfect couple. Augusto, the successful and generous businessman. Everyone said I was lucky. Neighbors would pass by and whisper. My friends at church looked at me with a mix of envy and respect. How lucky you are, Teresina, they'd say. A successful man from a good family, religious, and above all handsome. It was as if I were floating, you know? It was there that I began to discover the real Augusto. On the first night, he was so cold and distant that I felt like an object. When the tears came, confused and scared, he looked at me with disdain and said I should be grateful to have been chosen, insisting that many would give anything to be in my place. She was 16 years old and came from Caxias do Sul. She was a beautiful teenager with long dark hair, bright eyes, and a shy smile that appeared when she thought no one was watching her. What impressed me most about her was her determination. Those who see me all dressed up with my pocket watch hanging from my neck can't imagine I was once a prisoner of a marriage that disguised horrors the respectable society of this city worked hard to ignore. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. She had big dreams. She wanted to be a teacher, promised to study hard, save every penny, and one day open her own little school. She spoke fondly of her family, especially her sick mother, to whom she promised to send money. I saw a bit of myself in her, in a way. In the following days, he imposed rules about how I should dress, how to behave in public, and even whom I could or couldn't be friends with when we returned. Everything was explained with a chilling calmness, as if he were teaching a child. He always returned late, sometimes smelling of cigarettes and expensive liquor, other times with a new cologne I pretended not to notice. His mood varied greatly depending on the night. Sometimes he was radiant, talkative, almost welcoming. Other times he was grim and easily irritated. And I, trained to obey and be a good wife, silenced my cries and internalized these demands. I believed it was normal, that I needed to adapt, and that over time he would become more affectionate. I noticed how nervous she became when he got close, her hands slightly trembling as she served coffee whenever he showed up to ensure everything was in order. I started spending more time with her, coming up with activities to keep her by my side, away from him. I believe he noticed the aggression intensified during this time. After the boy left, he locked the living room door, took off his belt, and hit me as if I were a disobedient child. Then he calmly told me that I had embarrassed him and that I needed to learn my place. That night, lying in bed with my back raw, I realized I had made a terrible mistake, but it was already too late. The same innocence, the same dreams, the belief that the world could be good. Augusto seemed especially interested in Linda. He made a point of following her progress, as he put it. He passed by the store where she worked almost every day, always wearing a smile that never reached his eyes. How could I promise protection when I couldn't even protect myself? The next day, Linda was gone. Her clothes, the small suitcase with her belongings, the photo of her mother that she kept by her bed, all vanished. When I asked Augusto about it, he shrugged, as if it was no big deal. "Those girls from the countryside are ungrateful," he said while sipping his coffee. I gave her shelter and food, and in return she showed her gratitude by fleeing like a thief in the night, taking some jewelry from the store with her. I knew that wasn't true. I am 85 years old, carrying many stories that, if the walls of my store, memories of yesterday, could talk, would keep many important people in this city awake at night. Most people see me as a sweet old lady selling antiques, you know? They find it amusing how I examine each item as if it hides a treasure. About 2 months after the wedding, after one of those meetings, the first act of aggression happened. I had been talking too much with the gardener's son, a 17-year-old boy who helped me carry some groceries. Augusto saw us through the window. Their wives were like me, young, attractive, and silent. Some wore vacant expressions I only understood much later. Augusto showed me off like a trophy, always emphasizing that I came from a humble but honest family, as if that were an exotic curiosity. In their eyes, I saw the same spark I once had before I realized that not all prisons have visible bars. I noticed how nervous she became when he approached. A slight tremble in her hands, a tense smile, her eyes cast downward. I recognized those signs because they were the same I showed in his presence. I started protecting her in every way I could. The chain of stores had already expanded. There were now 5 locations scattered around Porto Alegre and its surroundings. Business was booming, and Augusto was seen as an innovative entrepreneur, focused not just on profits, but also on social welfare, as he often highlighted in his interviews. My simple clothes from Pelotas were donated, replaced by expensive dresses, fine shoes and jewelry, all chosen by him, of course. A wife of mine can't dress like just anyone, he insisted, inspecting each piece as if evaluating a product. Cold, calculating, as if he were measuring what the proper punishment should be. "Close the door," he ordered, with that calmness I had come to know and fear. I complied, of course. What else could I do? Do you know what the shop colleagues say about women who talk to other men behind their husbands' backs? And I, who have always loved nature, was captivated by his knowledge. I lost track of time and didn't notice Augusto arriving, standing at the window on the second floor, watching. When the boy left and I went inside, Augusto was waiting for me in the living room. I will never forget that look. Her mother was ill, probably with tuberculosis, and there were 3 younger siblings at home. Linda was the family's hope. Smart and determined, the way she spoke impressed me from the very first moment. "I want to be a teacher," she said. I remember the first day I walked inside, how out of place I felt, even hesitant to sit on the sofa, which looked extremely expensive. The maids, there were 3 of them, believe it or not, looked at me as if I were an intruder, not the lady of the house. And in a way, I really was an intruder.
In public, we were the perfect couple. Augusto, the exemplary businessman, expanding his ventures with vision and integrity, as the local newspaper reported. Teresina, the devoted wife, elegant and always impeccable by her husband's side.
I learned that certain colors were considered low class, and some styles were inappropriate for a respectable lady. I obeyed and even expressed gratitude, thinking he cared and wanted to help me adapt to the new world that was now mine. How naive I was. It wasn't help. It was control. And the worst part was that, in a way, he succeeded. What else could I do? Where could I go? Who would believe me against him? A respected man, influential, with friends in all kinds of important places. The pattern was set, and in the following months, it repeated with terrifying frequency. I knew that tone of voice, that look, and the way he watched her. About 2 months after Linda's arrival, 5 more girls had already been brought in through the program. All the young women, aged between 15 and 18, came from humble families in the countryside, each with similar stories of struggle and dreams for a better life. They worked hard in shops, studied at night at nearby public schools, and on weekends helped out by cleaning and organizing the accommodations. I visited them whenever I could, bringing cakes and sweets that I made secretly. Augusto disapproved of me cooking. He called a trusted doctor who wore the same pin on his lapel, bandaged my ribs without asking questions, avoiding eye contact. He prescribed morphine for the pain, which Augusto administered personally, controlling even that. And always, without fail, after these episodes, the gifts would appear. Jewelry, clothes, imported perfumes. On one occasion, after a particularly brutal beating that left my eye so swollen I could barely open it, he showed up with the paperwork for a new car, just for me. Something terrible was happening right under my nose, and by staying silent, I was becoming an accomplice. That's when I decided to take a risky step. I began to watch closely, take notes, and gather information. I bought a small notebook that I hid inside the lining of my sewing chair. I invented tasks to keep her away from him, asked her to help me with things in the main house during times I knew he'd be in the shop. I tried to be nearby when he conducted his inspections. On one occasion, when Augusto remarked on how smart and pretty Linda was for a country Italian girl, I felt a chill run down my spine. Sometimes on those occasions he even showed a sort of tenderness. But there were nights when he came back dark and irritable, locking himself in the study to drink alone. And if I dared make a sound or ask if everything was all right, I would get into serious trouble. It was a mansion worthy of admiration, with meticulously maintained gardens, imported furniture from Europe, and even a music room equipped with a piano, although no one in the house knew how to play a single note. It was the kind of home you only saw in magazines or movies. That place never became my home. It became my first prison. Augusto had very clear ideas about how the wife of an influential man should behave. From the very first days, he began to shape me. As he often said, my wardrobe went through a complete transformation. She planned to study hard, save every penny, send money home for her mother's treatment, and one day, who knows, open a small school in her town. From the beginning, Augusto showed a special interest in Linda. He would pass by the shop where she worked almost every day, watching her performance closely, as he liked to say. In it, I wrote down names, arrival dates, descriptions of the young women, their involvement in the special meetings, and when they vanished. I also recorded snippets of conversations I overheard between Augusto and his associates, as they called them, disjointed phrases about orders, goods, and dividing profits. With every filled page, the pattern became clearer and more terrifying. I found myself wondering what was really going on with those girls, where they were heading, and especially how I could survive knowing what I did. And I would smile, thank him, and play my part perfectly, because I knew what would happen if I didn't. I had learned that the walls of our mansion in Moinhos de Vento were thick enough to muffle screams. About a year after we moved to Porto Alegre, Augusto began talking about his new project. They lived in accommodations built behind the shops. Small, simple rooms, but always clean and organized. They earned minimum wage with housing and meals provided, along with the valuable opportunity to work for Augusto Bastos. At that moment, I admit I felt a certain excitement about the idea. They worked in the stores for a few months, attended special meetings, and inevitably, after some time, disappeared, always taking jewelry or money, according to Augusto, always at night, without warning, leaving no trace. With each disappearance, a knot tightened in my stomach, a chilling certainty sinking in. She was a 16-year-old girl, slim, with long black hair and dark eyes that seemed to hold all the dreams of the world. She came from Caxias do Sul, the daughter of impoverished Italian immigrants. Her father had died in an accident at the factory where he worked. I learned to read the signs, to predict storms by the way the key turned in the lock, by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was after one of those meetings, about 6 months after we moved to Porto Alegre, that the worst happened. "So you can have more independence," he said, as if he were the most generous husband in the world. The car stayed in the garage. I didn't have a driver's license, and he never let me learn to drive. He insisted that his wife shouldn't get her hands dirty in the kitchen. I would talk with them, listen to their stories and dreams for the future. I grew attached to them, especially Linda, who reminded me a lot of who I had been a few years earlier, full of hope and naivety. It was during this time that Augusto announced a special meeting of the Masonic Lodge for the upcoming Friday. The event was to be held at a country house belonging to one of the brothers outside the city, and a few selected female employees were chosen to serve drinks and food to the guests. Linda was on that list. Some nights he'd return lively and talkative, full of grand plans, calling me into the living room, pouring a glass of expensive wine that I had to taste, even though I hated it. He would talk about his plans, about how much his brothers trusted him, and about his rise to becoming an even more powerful man. But hold on. Before jumping straight to the climax, I need to start this story from the beginning, when I moved to Porto Alegre and felt like I had hit the jackpot in life. After the wedding, Augusto decided that pelotas was no longer enough for his ambitions. One afternoon, the gardener's son, a boy of about 17, slender and friendly, helped me carry some heavy bags that the delivery man had left at the door. The boy was polite and addressed me as ma'am. At just 19, I was already considered a ma'am. We talked a bit about plants. He knew every flower in the garden, every tree. That same week, a young woman arrived, and soon after, another, always following the same pattern. They were beautiful girls from humble countryside families full of hope. "Now you'll understand what it means to be a decent wife," he said, adjusting the belt and putting on his jacket again as if nothing had happened. and the boy would be sent away tomorrow. I spent 3 days in bed, delirious with fever and pain. Augusto told the staff that I had fallen down the stairs. The classic excuse. It would be a chance to have company, to do something meaningful, in addition to being Augusto's porcelain doll. Who knows? I might even be able to help these young women, guide them, be the support I never had. Once again, I was mistaken. The first to arrive was Linda. I will never forget the day I met her. To the public, it was a philanthropic gesture. But to me, he confided that it was a good business move, since the labor would be cheap, dedicated, and grateful for any opportunity. I was put in charge of preparing these girls, teaching them how to behave, serve customers, and dress appropriately. They were cultured, sophisticated women who often smiled, although they spoke very little. Now I understand that many of them experienced the same suffering I did, but at the time I thought they were happy and fulfilled, and that I simply wasn't trying hard enough to be like them. At charity events, social gatherings, and meetings with other influential couples, Augusto made a point of showing me off like a trophy. I was introduced as his princess. He would tell everyone how he had transformed this raw gem from pelotas into a true lady of society. When I hesitated, he tore it off himself. The beating was brutal. He didn't just hit my back like before. He aimed for my ribs, my arms, my legs. I felt the bone break on the 4th or 5th strike, a sharp pain that left me breathless. When he finally stopped, I was semi-conscious on the living room floor. I tried to explain that it wasn't like that the boy was just helping with the shopping, that he was just a kid, practically a child. It only made things worse. Augusto didn't raise his voice. He never did. Taking off the belt was a deliberate, precise move. "Take off the dress," he commanded. The household schedule was strictly regulated. Breakfast was served promptly at 7, even if he wasn't there to eat. Lunch came at noon, and dinner at 8. For the first few months, I wasn't allowed to go out alone. "Porto Alegre is dangerous for a girl from the countryside," he would say. Any slip-up, whether real or imagined, a dinner that didn't please him, a word taken out of context at a social event, a look he found disrespectful, resulted in violence. Sometimes it was just a slap. Other times, I endured beatings that left me unable to move for days. Tuesdays and Thursdays were the days I feared the most. Augusto would leave for what he called store meetings, always dressed in a special suit with that golden square and compass pin gleaming on his lapel. He would come back late, often in the early hours of the morning, and his mood was completely unpredictable. We acquired, or rather he acquired, a huge house in the Moinhos de Vento neighborhood, which was considered the most upscale area of Porto Alegre at the time. As I went out, I was accompanied by the older maid, Mrs. June, who, as I later found out, reported everything to him: where I was going, who I was talking to, and how long I was gone. My friendships were also carefully selected. Augusto introduced me to the wives of his brothers, men who wore a distinctive pin on their lapels. It was at this point that he introduced his sponsorship program. He would bring young women from the countryside, from humble families, to work in the stores and have the chance to study in the capital. An innovative project, according to Correio do Povo, which published a very positive article about the initiative. I was certain that Linda would never steal, never give up on her dream of helping her sick mother. But I stayed quiet. What else could I do? Augusto watched me with that cold stare, as if waiting for me to question his story, as if he was hunting for an excuse. Seeing her name twisted my stomach. I tried to argue with Augusto, saying she was too young, that maybe another girl, older and more experienced, would be a better fit. The reply was a slap so hard it knocked me to the kitchen floor, a trickle of blood running from the corner of my mouth. On the 4th day, when I finally managed to get up, I found on the dresser a velvet box with an emerald necklace that must have been worth a fortune. There was no card, no apology. That's how violence worked. First the aggression, then a gift, as if he could buy my forgiveness, my silence, my dignity.